My name is Lee Ullman, and I'm the Senior Director of the MIT Sloan Latin America office. This is part of MIT Sloan Global Programs. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Arnold Barnett, the George Eastman Professor of Management Science. His research specialty is applied mathematical modeling. In a regular year, Arnie usually comes down to Latin America once a year to visit a new and different country. Unfortunately, this year or last year, it would have been Argentina, but due to the pandemic, the MIT Sloan Latin America office has moved all of its programming online. Arnie usually speaks about health and statistical modeling in safety. One of the areas that many of you might have heard his name is with airline safety. He's been rather popular lately with the middle seat on airlines, on whether airlines should be restricting people on using the middle seat or not. But tonight he's going to speak about something that is of great importance, especially because of all of the elections going on currently in Latin America, and about the election that just took place in the United States. So Arnie will speak about the 2020 US presidential election, some statistics and thoughts. Again, it really is a great pleasure to have Arnie with us tonight. Before we start, I would like to mention some rules. So the chat function is entirely open. You're more than welcome to use the chat to discuss amongst yourselves, also to ask questions. But on the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, so a question and answer button. That is really the best way to ask questions. And you're also able to upvote other people's questions. So if you see a question there that you like or you wanted to ask, you're more than welcome to upvote it. And so what will happen is Arnie will speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll start to do a Q&A based on the questions in the Q&A section and through the chat. So thank you all for being here tonight, and I very much look forward to Arnie's talk.
Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to speak with you. As Lee said, I have been fortunate to visit Latin America in connection with the MIT program. I've been to Chile, to Brazil, to Colombia and Peru, and have enjoyed the visits very much and hope there will be many more such visits. And I understand that it's an interesting time now, particularly in Peru. You have a presidential election going on. I'm not sure what happened in the United States is of direct relevance, but we'll see. And for those of you who have ties to MIT, it's good as always to speak with you. MIT is soldiering on. And when the pandemic ends, as we all hope is very soon, MIT will be strong. I hope every one of us will be strong at that time. Let me begin by sharing a screen. And let's see, have I succeeded in sharing it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, then we will go to the next phase and we'll actually look at the slideshow itself. Okay, and the show is about the 2020 US presidential elections, some statistics about it, particularly related to polling, and some thoughts about how America elects a president. This is a picture of President Trump. This is not a political statement one way or the other, but he does look a little bit forlorn, and I think people would assume he is somewhat forlorn in the aftermath of the election. But let's talk about a few things related to the election. First of all, did the polls fail disastrously? The polls had suggested an easy victory for Joe Biden. And he did win, but not by as much as was expected. And does this represent a disastrous failure on the part of the polls? But secondly, in America, the election is based upon the Electoral College. This is an institution that has no analogs in any other country in the world. So perhaps I should explain it to you, some of its idiosyncrasies, and talk about why some people would like to abolish it and what one might do short of abolition that might make it less an object of hatred on the part of so many. Anyway, I want to stress when the treatment of polling, which will be a little more than half of my talk, is joint work with Arnold. Arnold is a student at MIT's Masters of Business Analytics program. He is from France and has been remarkably tolerant in thinking about the political system in the United States. Some of the work about the Electoral College is joined with Professor Edward Kaplan of Yale, and I acknowledge their important contributions to what I say. First of all, let's talk about the polls in the United States in the 2020 election. I think it's fair to say not everyone was pleased by the polls. These are headlines that I was able to get from prestigious publications. We have the New York Times is represented, the Washington Post, Atlantic Magazine, etc. And you'll see that generally they talked in rather apocalyptic terms about the failure of the polls. Did 2020 kill the polls? A catastrophe for American democracy, a failure that somehow will not fit under rugs, an embarrassment for an already shaky field. So this is what people are saying. The question is, are these concerns justified? As I said, the reason you got such strong denunciations was that there had been an anticipation of a very strong victory by Joe Biden. It failed to materialize, certainly on election day itself. And this led to frustration and withering assessments. The question is, were they justified? In thinking about that matter, I think we should go to a serious source. There is the website you may have heard of, 538, which has, among other things, lots of information about American elections. And the website consolidates all kinds of polls and tries in various weighting schemes and whatnot to determine which polls deserve greater weight than others, and to come up with an assessment of what's going to happen in the election. What we're going to do is look at the last assessment just before the election that arose from 538 and compare it to what actually happened as a guide to how the strongest pollsters in the United States and the strongest analysts of polls fared in actuality. Okay, now, before we do that, though, let me tell you something about the Electoral College. And as I told you, no other country has anything remotely like it. Here's the way it works. Every one of the 51 states in the United States has members of the Electoral College. When I say 51, you might say, I thought America had 50 states. Well, it does, but Washington, D.C. is counted as a state for the purposes of the Electoral College, although for no other purposes. Anyway, the number of electoral votes, the number of that are counted in the Electoral College varies from state to state. Every state has two because each state has two senators. The remainder are based on the state's population. So the least populous states have only one member of the House of Representatives, and therefore they have a total of 3 in Congress, and they have 3 votes in the Electoral College. California, the most populous American state, had 55 electoral votes in the election of 2020. Just yesterday, information came out about new census results, and I gather in the next election, California will be down to 54. But anyway, it was up at 55 at the election that took place last November. Okay, so each state has a number of electoral votes, and with very few exceptions, the way the votes are counted in choosing the president is winner take all in each state, meaning whoever gets the majority of votes in the state or the largest number of votes gets all of the state's electoral votes. So a candidate with 51% of the vote would get 100% of the electoral votes for that state. There are 2 technical exceptions, one of them in Maine, one of them in Nebraska, involving 1 electoral vote. And we needn't talk about that now in great detail. But this is the basic framework. The aim in the election is to get as many electoral votes as you can. There are a total of 538 in the country altogether. You might say, what a coincidence. That website is called 538. No, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a coincidence. That's why it's called 538. There are 538 electoral votes in total. A candidate who has 270 or more will win the election. Okay? I say, now, what does 538 do? Just before the election, it estimated the probability in the last election that Joe Biden would win and the complementary probability that Donald Trump would win. Okay, those were the two major candidates. There were some fringe candidates in some states that got something like 1% of the vote, but we won't discuss them here. We're not going to live forever and we can't talk about technicalities like that. Anyway, 538 estimated the probability of winning and also estimated what share of the vote each of the candidates would get. And we're going to be doing so. Then they came up with an overall national projection. This is what they did. And let's talk about what they did in the election and compare it to what actually happened. It turned out in the election, as I said, there were 538 electoral votes in total. And this is what 538, the website, the respected consolidator, was telling us based on the polls. It said the states fall into three categories. There are 24 states with a total of 205 electoral votes that we can pretty much assume Donald Trump is going to win. The polls suggest it isn't even close there. There were another 21 states with 232 electoral votes that really could be expected to go for Joe Biden. So even though Biden had a smaller number of states, they were more populous and thus they involved more electoral votes. But neither of them was above the number 270 that's needed for victory. The outcome of the election would depend upon 6 swing states. What are these states? Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And I've listed the number of electoral votes from each of those states. If you add them up, it adds up to 101 votes. And given the fact that Biden was ahead by 27 in the states that were considered a sure thing, what really had to happen for victory for President Trump was that he'd have to get at least 65 of the 101 in the category that were swing. In other words, he couldn't just get some of them. He had to get the majority of the electoral votes. He had to get about 2/3 of the electoral votes, or he would not win. Or to put it another way, the most he could lose would be 36. But let's keep that in mind in thinking about what we're being told. This is what we're being told by 538. I'm not saying this is necessarily an accurate depiction of what's happening in any state. I'm just saying this is the way they set up the election. Okay? And from their point of view, the key question was how many of the 6 swing states will Trump carry? Okay, now, of course, they have varying numbers of electoral votes, and we would have to take that into account in theory. But for the moment, let's say one of the tests on 538 is how well it did in predicting the number of the 6 swing states that Trump would carry, the states that were considered very close. Okay, and actually, if you go to 538, and I went to the final reckoning before the polls, they don't tell us how many of those 6 states Trump is likely to win. They told us the probability Trump would win in each of those states. But they didn't address an issue that I'd like to address now. And that is, the fact is that outcomes in different states are often correlated. That if I tell you what's happening in one state, it gives me new information about what's likely to happen in others. And in that sense, simple use of the probabilities can be misleading. Let me give a simple example. Suppose you have 2 states that you know year in and year out, they always vote the same way. Well, then as a practical matter, President Trump is going to carry either both of them or none of them. You're not going to have a 1-1 split when historically they've never gone in opposite directions. Okay, so that's something we have to take into account. And the question then is, how do we take it into account that there is correlation among the states? In other words, how do we supplement the 538 probability information with other information to tell us what we really can expect to happen in the election? And this we can do with a little bit of statistical detective work. And I say coupled with our dazzling MIT skill in solving linear equations. That is meant to be an ironic remark. Don't say, oh, the guy is so conceited as if he can solve linear equations. Many of us can, but there are linear equations I'm going to present. I want to consider now 2 states, North Carolina and Florida, which are both swing states. In the previous 12 elections before 2020, 10 out of the 12 times they went the same way. In other words, 83% of the time. 538 said that Trump's chance of victory was 36% in North Carolina and 31% in Florida. In other words, 538 predicted that Biden would carry both states, but Trump had something like a 1 in 3 chance of carrying each state. So given that, if we're focusing on President Trump for the moment, what is the chance he would carry both of the states, taking into account that their outcomes tend to be correlated somewhat? Well, the way we can evaluate that is actually to write out linear equations, okay? And let's write them out. One of them related to the historical correlation, the other's related to what 538 said. And let's see, the first equation says that the chance that they would both go the same way, we're estimating it as 83% because that's the historical percentage, okay? Notice that there's a 31% chance of carrying Florida, and notice how the two quantities I've defined the quantities at the top. So in other words, there are two mutually exclusive ways that Trump could carry Florida. He could carry both states, or he could carry Florida but lose North Carolina. Similarly, there's a 36% chance Trump will win in North Carolina, and that can happen because he wins both states, or he loses Florida but wins in North Carolina. And of course, the sum of the probabilities for all four possibilities has to be 1. There are 4 possibilities, right? Trump wins both, Biden wins both, Trump wins Florida, not North Carolina, Trump wins North Carolina, not Florida. But ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have been at MIT or have been to high schools that had good mathematics programs would know, we know how to solve 4 linear equations and 4 unknowns. In fact, in this case, it's surprisingly easy to do so. And I'd like you to see the results. If we solve these 4 linear equations and 4 unknowns, you know what they say? They say there's a 57% chance Joe Biden will carry both states, a 26% chance that Trump will carry both states. There is, of course, a chance of carrying North Carolina of 11%, but not Florida, and 5%, excuse me, it was a 6%, I believe. Is it Florida, but not, yes, North Carolina. I'm sorry, I can't see all these numbers here because I see your pictures. So in some sense, I'm flying blind. So if I say things that seem irrational, that's a possible explanation for it. Now, you might say, well, what's interesting about this? Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. If we really believed different outcomes are independent, you know, if you have 2 independent outcomes in probability, the chance they both occur is the product of their probabilities. If I toss a coin once and then toss it a second time, the chance of getting 2 heads in a row is 1/2 of the first time, 1/2 of the second. You take on half times a half and say there's a 1 in 4 chance of getting 2 heads in a row. So here, if we really treated the results in North Carolina and Florida as independent, using the multiplicative rule, we would say the chance of carrying both of them would be 36% of 31% or 11%. But because they tend to go the same way, the chance of a double victory is not 11%, it's actually about 26%. And in that way, in other words, combinations that might be favorable to President Trump might be more likely than you might initially think based on the raw data in 538. Okay? Anyway, let me tell you that Arnold and I worked together for all the swing states, calculating correlations among them and doing things like what I just did numerous times. And then we got the following chart. As I say, the chart, the histogram itself was prepared by Arnold. If I had prepared it, it would probably look somewhat like the painting Guernica by Picasso. But here is a nice chart, and it's interesting. It's saying, given all the probabilities and the correlations, there's about a 40% chance Trump will not win a single one of the swing states, in which case he's doomed. There's a small chance of winning 1, but a larger chance of winning exactly 2. That's the most likely outcome, a probability about 41, 42%. There is a chance of 3, 4, 5, and 6, but the chances are not very high, okay? That in other words, based upon the polls, taking 538 seriously, remember, we're testing to see whether it should be taken seriously, but given that this is what it tells us about what to expect, it's telling us something about whether or not Trump is likely to win the election. And what it's saying is, let's do the following. Let's look at that chart for the numbers 1 through 6, for the number of the 6 swing states that Trump might carry. And in terms of what he needs, remember the number of electoral votes, he needs 65. If he winds up winning none of them, and there's a 40% chance of that according to 538, then he definitely loses. He also definitely loses if he wins only one or if he wins two. There's just not enough in any two of them to give him 65 electoral votes. Notice 0, 1, and 2 add up to 90% probability. So already the prediction is going somewhat against President Trump. Now, for 3 electoral votes, if he wins 3 out of 6, this is interesting. There's a 6% chance he will win 3 out of 6. But if he wins 3 out of 6, he has to win one particular set to prevail in the election. He has to win Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Well, that's one way of getting 3 out of 6. But there are a lot of other ways. You could get, let's say, North Carolina and Arizona and Florida, and so on. In fact, there are 20 ways of getting a set of 3, 20 combinations of 3 states, which would give him a 3-3 record. And of the 20, only one of them, namely Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, will push him over the top. So if he gets 3, in other words, that's probably not enough. On the other hand, 4, 5, and 6 probably is enough. For 4, he probably, if he wins 4, he has to win Florida, but given that Florida is one of the states he's likeliest to win, if he gets the 4, he's probably going to be over the top. 5 and 6, he'd definitely be over the top. So in other words, we were able to say, we know how many probabilistically he's going to win out of the 6. And given that he wins that number, what's the chance he's going to prevail in the election? Well, if you work it out, what we're really being told by 538 is that, taking everything into account, the chance that President Trump would prevail was approximately 2.3%, about 1 in 44. And the chance that President Biden, now President Biden, would prevail was 97.7%. And I gave this number to a group of MIT alumni just before the election, alumni who have been unusually generous with the school in their donations. And I remember thinking that if in fact President Trump wins after I give a probability like this, maybe the donations would not be forthcoming as much, given that they would question the competence of the faculty. Anyway, we do know that 538 actually did predict the winner correctly, in the sense that President Trump did not win. But let's look at the 6 states, though. Let's look what happened there, and what does that tell us about it? In fact, President Trump did carry 2 of those 6 states. And if you remember the graph I just showed you, under 538, that was the likeliest outcome for the number of states he would win. The 2 states that he won were Florida and North Carolina. In other words, the 2 states that were the part of my calculation just now. I said there was a 26% chance he would win both. Well, he did win both, okay? As far as the other states, the 45 others, every one of them behaved the way 538 expected in terms of who was the winner and who was the loser. And given that Trump only won 2 of the swing states, he was doomed to defeat. In other words, looking at it this way, 538 and the polls that it summarized, 538 didn't pick its numbers out of the air. It looked at all of the polls in each individual state and tried to combine them in the most sensible way. But it didn't really do very badly. It correctly predicted the outcome. It correctly predicted the number of the 6 swing states that Trump would win, in the sense that if you had to make a prediction, you would have to go with 2. And it correctly predicted the other 45 states were pretty much foregone conclusions for one candidate or the other. So in that respect, they did a good job and they deserve respect. But how well did it perform at the level of individual states? And one way of looking at that is to say, if you actually look, in every state, 538 gives a probability Biden will win and a probability that Trump will win. And in some states, in some sense, it tells us the probability that if you go with its favorite, you're going to make a mistake. For example, in Florida, they said Biden was going to win, 69% chance, but that gave Trump a 31% chance of winning. In other words, if we take 538 literally, they're saying there's a 31% chance their prediction in Florida is going to be wrong. You know, it's a little bit like the weather forecaster who says there's a 60% chance of rain. You know, the person was not saying it's definitely going to rain. The person, however, is saying it's more likely than not. So in the same way that for the weather forecaster, you would take into account that he hedged it with a 40% chance of no rain, the hedging probability here, the probability of being wrong, is something we might take into account in assessing how well 538 did? Well, I'll tell you something. We looked at all 51 states at the probability that the loser, according to 538, would actually win those states. And we try to say, out of the 51, how many times do you expect them to be wrong, given the probabilities of being wrong that they themselves assess for the 51 states? And it turns out they would expect to be wrong only about 5 times on average. In other words, there's a 31% chance they'd be wrong in the state of Florida. But in most states, they were saying it was either overwhelmingly for Trump or overwhelmingly for Biden. So they say there's very little probability of being wrong in those states. So looking across the 51, they only expected on average to be wrong about 5 times, 5 out of 51. In other words, to have a 10% error rate. Well, it's interesting to look at how many states they actually got wrong, although I've sort of already told you. The actual result was they got only 2 erroneous predictions in terms of who the winner would be out of the 51 that they made. And you might say, oh, what states were those? Well, if you're saying that, you were not paying enough attention earlier in the talk, because those are the 2 states we've already identified as errors for 538, namely Florida and North Carolina. Those are the only states in which their predictions of the winner were not accurate. And even there, they said there was about a 1 in 3 chance that Trump would carry each. And given the correlations, as we've said, it's not that much of a shock. In other words, at this level, 538 did a good job. But there's another level for looking at things. And that is, they not only predicted who the winner would be and assigned probabilities to that, but they forecast the share of the vote that President Trump would get in each state. And of course, by implication, the percentage that Joe Biden would get. And not only did they give us an estimate, they gave us a range, which they said has an 80% chance of including the true victory, the true percentage for President Trump, okay? 80% is a strange range. Those of you who've studied probability are used to 95% confidence intervals, 90%. They focused on an 80% interval. Anyway, for the state of New Hampshire, for example, they predicted that President Trump would get 42.8% of the vote, and the range of possibilities extended from 39% to 47%. In other words, about 4 percentage points in either way from the prediction. What we looked at is, where did the actual outcome arise in terms of this range and this distribution? And I can tell you very simply, in New Hampshire, that what Trump actually got 45.5% of the votes. Well, you say, well, that's not bad. It's within the range 39 to 47. Yes, it's a little higher than the middle, which was, I believe, 42.7. But on the other hand, in itself, it's not a big deal. But on the other hand, when we looked at 51 states, we noticed again and again that President Trump's actual share was exceeding the point estimate. In some cases, it was toward the upper end of the 80% range. In some cases, it was above the entire range. In 47 of the 51 states, President Trump outperformed the estimate of his share of the vote that came up from 538, okay? Now, you might say, how impressive is that? Well, let me tell you something. If we assume that their prediction was meant to be the middle of the interval, then you would expect that if the predictions are right, about half the time they should be too high and half the time they should be too low, assuming they don't get it exactly right to 6 decimal places, okay? But they were too low, 47 out of 51. Imagine if you have a coin that's supposed to be fair, meaning equally likely to give heads and tails. You toss it 51 times, heads come up 47 times, tails come up only 4 times. If you continue to believe that the coin is fair, despite that outcome, then I think you really should maybe go to an infirmary or something and do something to relax, because the probability of getting 47 heads out of 51 tosses of a fair coin is so close to 0 that if you ask a calculator to do it, it will just give you a string of zeros. The answer is indescribably infinitesimal. In other words, there was a tendency toward underestimation. We looked at this statistically in some other ways I won't describe now, but you get the general idea. The numbers were too low. but that actually tells us a little bit about why everyone hated the pollsters, or lots of people hated the pollsters, because they did systematically underestimate President Trump's performance. Not by too much, but they did. They tended to underestimate it. And that meant on election night, people saw that President Trump was doing better than the polls had suggested he would do. And those who were opposed to his reelection utterly panicked. You see, what actually happened when we looked at 538 is that on average, it was too low by about 2 percentage points. And the errors occurred everywhere. Even in a very blue state like New York, they were too low by about 2. Even in a red state like North Dakota, they were too low by about 2 or 3. In other words, it wasn't that there were some states where they underpredicted, some states where they overpredicted. They underpredicted practically everywhere. Okay? And the point is, they underpredicted by 2 points. And that was not enough for President Trump to achieve victory. But if their underprediction had been 3 or 4, that would have been enough for him to achieve victory. So on the election night itself, we wasn't sure how much underreporting there was, underestimation there was, but it was pretty clear that there was underestimation. There were a lot of people who thought, oh, OMG, as the kids say these days, President Trump is going to win. As you know, it took 5 more days for the victory to be confirmed. So in other words, what people remember about the polls was that on election night itself, and in the days immediately thereafter, President Trump was doing better than predicted. And until it was known how much better, the outcome of the election itself was not really known. Okay? So in other words, how does it all add up about how the polls did? Look, I think they generally did well. They certainly got the election result correct. They did underestimate President Trump's performances across the board in individual states by an average of 2 percentage points. And, you know, ironically, if you look at their results at the state level, they didn't do really any better than 2016. But the big difference was in 2016, they predicted a Clinton victory and President Trump won, whereas in 2020, the person they expected to win, namely Joe Biden, did win. So in terms of the bottom line, they did emerge better, and probably some of the bitterness toward the polls is dissipating now that the fears that they aroused turned out to be unwarranted. But that helps to explain they didn't do a perfect job. They did somehow underestimate, and you might say, well, in some of these blue states, people were ashamed to tell the pollsters they were for Trump. Maybe that's true, but that wouldn't explain why Trump's share was underreported in states like North Dakota, where you might be more likely to feel embarrassed to say you're not for Trump than to say you're for Trump, given these heavily red states. And yet even there, they were too low by something like 2 percentage points. So something did go wrong, but it didn't go terribly wrong. And in terms of the overall particulars of the election, they did a reasonably good job. Anyway, I can talk more about that later. I know, of course, you have an election coming up in Peru and are very interested in polling accuracy. I don't know about the American experience, what it tells you, except that in a case where it was difficult to poll, the pollsters did pretty well, okay? Except for a small hidden vote, you could say, for President Trump. But that's essentially what the story is. Anyway, I will stop here. At the end, I'm happy to answer questions, of course. Now I'd like to change topics on something else and to say, you know, the Electoral College, the winner take all rule, et cetera, lots and lots of Americans are opposed to it. And I'd like to talk now, you know, the MIT has the slogan, what, mans o manos or something like that. It's sort of an attempt at a practical proposal that might, in theory, make people happy. So let's talk about that. Again, some people want it abolished and we just have a national popular vote. Never mind what state you're in, who gets the largest number of votes nationwide. Others are staunch defenders of the Electoral College and they fight it out bitterly. Is it possible you could get something that could make them happy, something in between? And that's what I want to talk about now, a possibility. And it's really a simple scheme, actually. It simply says, let's retain the Electoral College as it is. Don't abolish it. In terms of every state's number of members of the Electoral College will remain the same. The only thing is, instead of just winner take all, we will allocate a state's electoral votes in direct proportion to the state's popular vote spread. For example, we see Connecticut had 7 electoral votes in 2020. Biden won 59.3%, Trump won 39.2%. The other candidates won just 1.5 points. So under this scheme, Biden would get 59.3% of 7, he'd get 4.15, Trump would get 2.74, and the remaining candidates would get the rest. Okay, so that's the scheme. And then we would add up across all the 51 states, and the candidate who had the highest number of points accumulated this way would actually become the president, regardless of what the highest number is. Okay, an obvious question at this point might be, so what? Actually, I think this scheme would have a lot of desirable attributes. First of all, one of the reasons people don't want to shift away from the Electoral College is that they say it benefits the small states. These states, because they have 2 senators, have 3 people in the Electoral College, when based on population, they'd only have 1. And they say you can't do something and take it away. The small states think it's critical to their identity and their importance. However, if we actually went to this scheme, it would actually increase the power of the small states rather than decrease it. And the reason is they would continue to retain their 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 electoral votes, but the formula takes into account not just the fact of victory, but the margin of victory. Winning by 40 percentage points in these formulas benefits you more than winning by 1 percentage point. You might say, well, why does that help the small states? It helps the small states because they vote more lopsidedly than the electorate as a whole, okay? And that is, and for example, in 2016, the states with 3 electoral votes, the margin of victory was on average 35%, only 16% of the rest of the country. Well, when you have a formula where it takes into account the size of your victory, it turns out that in that formula, these 7 states actually have their influence magnified by a factor of 2. Let me just very quickly go through these slides. This is something I did with Ed Kaplan. We looked at the states that are small, 3, 4, 5, and 6 electoral votes. In 2004, for example, the ones with 3 electoral votes, they only had 2.2% of the popular vote. Because of the electoral vote scheme, they had 4.5%. But if you took into account the margin of victory and not just the fact of victory, their share would go up to 10.2%. And if you look at that bottom line in yellow, for all of these categories, basically moving to this framework would increase their influence. The small states had nothing to fear from this scheme, okay? So that's one source of opposition. But then there's something else. Of the 5 largest states in America, 4 of them are effectively irrelevant in the presidential election because it's a foregone conclusion who's going to win. The only one that's a swing state is actually our friend Florida. These 4 irrelevant states have 1/3 of the American population. If we actually had a scheme where the margin of victory matters and not just the fact of victory, then the candidates would have a strong incentive to visit those states and care about them. You know, going from 42 to 44% in California for the loser would benefit that person as much as gaining 2 percentage points in 6 average size states. So in other words, because the specific margin of error would matter, the 4 largest states that are now irrelevant would become relevant again. And you could say that's an advantage. It benefits the largest states, it benefits the smallest states, okay? It would eliminate some of the worst consequences of the winner-take-all rule. And in particular, in Florida in 2000, as some of you may remember, it turned out that Bush and Gore were essentially tied, and there was a question of who was actually slightly ahead based on hanging chads in some of the votes and whatnot. Under this scheme, if you basically have a tie, the 2 sides basically cancel each other out, right? They both get the same number of votes from the state. So a tie is treated as a tie and the state effectively abstains. But maybe that's the most reasonable thing to do rather than have half of its population be anointed over the other half. So you could say that's another advantage of the scheme. Another advantage is that the election could not go to the House of Representatives. It can now, under the present Electoral College, if no candidate gets more than 269 electoral votes. And then the president is chosen under bizarre rules where every one of the 50 states has the same 1 vote. Okay, so Wyoming and California are counted the same way. There will be no danger of that under this scheme. Furthermore, if you actually look what happens, it basically tracks the popular vote split extremely well. On average, over the elections from 1960 to 2020, the difference is 9/20ths of 1 percentage point, a factor of 4 closer to the popular vote than the results in the Electoral College. In other words, as a practical matter, you have your popular vote, even without the formality of calling it a popular vote. Okay? Also, one last thing, I'm almost finished. It turns out that it doesn't even have a partisan bias. People might say, well, does it benefit the Democrats? Does it benefit the Republicans? And the answer is no, not really. In these very close elections, in one of them, it goes to the Republican, George W. Bush. In the other one, it would go to Hillary Clinton. Okay? So where are we? Look, I think this scheme, which I've just quickly introduced, it would give the popular vote advocates 97% of what they want, meaning an outcome that essentially reflects the popular vote. For those who want to keep the small states happy, they get more than 100% of what they want. The big states benefit. Is that enough for it to get serious consideration? Okay, and here you run into one big problem. And that is, what about the swing states? What about Florida, which is now so important that the candidates spend much of their time there, although it's a lovely place to spend time under any circumstances. But in any case, if Florida is a swing state and it's practically tied, and thus its net effect on the election is minimal, it goes from the top to the bottom. Will the people of Florida go along with that? Probably not. And then if the swing states decline to be part of this new scheme, our calculations, some of the ones I've done with our no show, the system really doesn't work well. So in other words, a real problem in getting this implemented is that it's really only very effective if all states take part. And at the moment, I don't think you can realistically expect all states to take part. So again, it's one of these ideas that has, I think, a lot of conceptual attractiveness, but in terms of its practicality, I'm not exactly sure at the, actually, I am sure that at the moment it's in trouble. So where are we very briefly? Both the polls and the Electoral College will live to see another day. Many Americans will continue to hate the polls. Many Americans will continue to hate the Electoral College, but I think they will both be central to American elections for many years to come. And again, I'm not sure to what extent these findings generalize to other countries, but this is what happened, I think, in the United States in 2020 and what might happen in the years ahead. Anyway, I think I would stop here. Let me see, have I gone? Well, a little bit gone. No, it was pretty close to schedule, okay?
So
and
thank you
obviously,
so
I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever Lee and Jacqueline think should happen next.
Sure. So thank you, Arnie, so much. And so some of the questions that are coming in are about underestimating a candidate. So the first question, and I'll ask you a couple about this. What are the possible reasons why polls can underestimate a candidate?
Well, I guess there can be many reasons. One of them can be that they strive for a random sample of the electorate, but do not succeed. In the United States, many of the people who are asked their preferences simply refuse to be part of the polls. And that raises the issue of non-response bias. How does what you learn from those who respond compare to those who do not respond? So that can be a problem. There may be a case where people, in some instances, lie. There might seem to be an incentive to lie in some cases about what you're doing. It is said that in some of the states where President Trump was considered, beyond the pale, that some people who were for him were sort of quiet about it and wouldn't want to tell a pollster about it. I don't know whether or not that's a phenomenon you would see in Peru or anywhere else. But there are a lot of problems in actually getting to people. For example, how do you get to people? If you use telephones, let's say, then the people who don't have telephones are not really reachable. If you try to do something with the internet, then those who are not internet savvy are not reachable. So any means of trying to reach people these days will tend to exclude certain parts of the electorate. And while they attempt to correct for these problems, it's not clear that the corrections are always going to work out. So there are many reasons that you might not really get a representative sample among those who answer your questions.
So some of the questions are getting right at that. What if you were a pollster? What would you do to adjust for this underestimation or underestimate factor? Or another question that's very similar is how do you decrease the variance in projected vote shares estimates? So what would you advise people to avoid these issues?
Well, first of all, decreasing the variance is good, presuming the mean is correct. If you reduce the uncertainty around an estimate that's wrong, then things have gotten worse rather than better. But look, obviously, they say bigger sample sizes, sampling theory tells you, tend to give you more reliable results because you're not so vulnerable to the luck of the draw. I think that one thing that's done, and I don't know whether it's done successfully, is something about the characteristics of the electorate. And are the respondents reflecting those characteristics? For example, in the United States, women tend to vote in slightly larger numbers than men, something like 52% to 48%. So are you taking that into account? If you have a poll which is 55% men, then you might say that that is misrepresenting the electorate in a certain way if there's a gender difference. So you have to look at variables. In the United States, they were looking at whether or not people had gone to college or not, or they might check by income, or they might check by ethnicity, et cetera. So the question is, are you matching on those dimensions? And if you're conspicuously not matching on certain dimensions that seem relevant in terms of the way people vote, that's something to worry about. They do apply corrections to these things, but the issue is, are these corrections themselves reliable? And thus a certain amount of testing has to go on. It's not an easy process. I don't have a simple answer to what can be done. But I think the first thing to do is just to look and see, where did your sample come from? How many people refused to be part of the sample? What is the histogram of outcomes for those in the sample compared to those in the population on a number of relevant dimensions? And if you are short of people, let's say in the United States, let's suppose for some reason you notice that people from Oregon didn't make it into your poll, then maybe that's a good reason to do some additional polling in the state of Oregon. Okay, so in other words, you have to look and see what's wrong and come up with remedies that accommodate what you see.
So Arnie, there was a question about the state level predictions that have to do with polling errors and how would the correlation fix this? So he's curious about 538's forecast and how the state level predictions would ultimately fix the correlations.
Well, they don't necessarily. If you just do state level correlations and you treat the states as independent, then you haven't. Now, 538 does something. They don't tell us exactly what they do, but they do supposedly take correlations into account. We tried to take correlation into account quite simply by looking at how often the states have gone the same way. I mean, the simple logic is, if you have two states, and you sometimes have it, that have gone the same way the last 12 elections, it's a pretty good bet they're going to go the same way this time. So that might be an ingredient in a calculation about the level of correlation. But taking into account correlation, I guess, can help you in the sense that if in one of the states the polling result turns out to be weird, then maybe the fact that you got a different result in the other state is a warning that maybe you shouldn't take the results as literally as you might otherwise.
So Arnie, someone wrote that 538's final prediction was 80% Biden. And you told us that your prediction was 97.7% Biden. So what's the difference in that 17.7%? How are you so sure that Biden was going to win? What are you doing? Or
Well,
what can you reveal to help others?
Yeah, if someone said that 538 said there was an 80% chance Biden would win, that's not accurate. At the very last prediction, I think it gave something like a 94% chance that Biden would win. Okay, so in other words, it was not 80 versus 97.7. And I'm not exactly sure the reason for the difference. I think, let me just say that I think 538, there is a certain conservatism in the way they do these things, because sometimes something that happens at the very last minute changes in election results. For example, in the 2016 election, there was the question of Hillary Clinton's emails, if you vaguely remember that. And so I think because something can happen at the last minute, I think they hedge their bets a little bit up until the very end, even beyond the polling results. But what we were doing is to say, let's use the polling results up to the last minute and not put in a hedging factor because of some early November surprise. But no, it was not 80 versus 97. It was 94 versus 97. And I stand by our number, by the way.
I'm glad to hear it. So here's a good question. Are there methods to estimate if there's an effect from the polls into the real result, or asked differently, since the polls come before the real election, they probably have causal effect on how people vote. So are you aware of that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because certainly it's a possibility. In some cases, for example, if you think your candidate is utterly destined to lose, you might say, why go to the polls? Of course, the scheme we describe, weighted vote share, it helps your candidate even if the candidate loses, because the margin of loss will matter and not just the fact of loss. But as far as the extent to which the polls influence the electorate and not just the electorate in the polls, I agree with you. There is a dimension of two-dimensional causality. However, if you just look at the polls themselves, they tend to do pretty well. Now, of course, at any given time, the poll might be reflecting outcomes that themselves were influenced by earlier polls. I can't really address that issue. But I agree, it's certainly when we hear about the polls, I think in some cases, it has influenced people. On the other hand, now, I think, frankly, in America, there's so much suspicion of the polls that I don't think that people will be deterred from going to the election because the poll looks bad for their candidates, because they basically, the old Mayor Daley of Chicago once said, what the hell do the experts know? I think that's a widespread sentiment about pollsters in America today.
Excellent. So something that's being asked is, in the US, voting is not mandatory. What adds another component to the which adds another component to the equation? How to address this as a pollster? And it's interesting because in some Latin American countries, voting is mandatory, and in others, such as Chile, it's not mandatory. So how does that play into the pollster's equation of understanding the outcome?
Well, in America, it makes it more difficult. And the pollsters do try to assess which of the people they ask are likely to go to the polls. They typically ask, did you vote last time? They look at other elements and try to make an educated guess. But that's another element of uncertainty that American pollsters face. In countries where voting is compulsory, you might think that issue of trying to guess who's going to the polls might be less important. And in that sense, you might think, all factors equal, the polling results might be more reliable. Okay, but we don't have a mandatory voting here, of course. And in fact, if you look at how many people, of those who are registered, most do go to vote, but a lot of people are not registered, and that itself is a subject of controversy.
So Arnie, we're getting to the end, but a good question that just came in is, what is the likely impact of increased early and mail-in voting on prediction reliability?
Well, that's an interesting question. We saw these as much bigger phenomena in the 2020 election than in previous elections because of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's hard to tell. You could say that to the extent that it's possible to mail in a vote, and other things like that, then the probability that the person you talk to will actually vote may be greater, because it doesn't depend on what that person does on election day itself, et cetera. But I don't think we know that yet, frankly. I mean, we can see, for example, to the extent that we see a phenomenon like the underestimation of Trump's support, that also happened in 2016 when there was no pandemic and much less voting by mail and absentee balloting and whatnot. So in other words, in statistics, it often is the case that the same data are consistent with lots of different hypotheses. And at the moment, I don't have an answer about mail-in voting. Some states have been doing it for a long while and say it works very, very well. But it was in place much more extensively in 2020 than in previous elections.
Arnie, we've just about come to the end. Before we go, I wanted to thank May and Jacqueline Paris from MIT Sloan Global Programs for helping set this talk up, all the people in the audience, and obviously you for taking the time to speak with us. And I wanted to know if you could just leave us with some parting thoughts for all of the elections that are currently happening in South America. What would be your advice for those people watching the news and listening to all of the pollsters on what's going to happen?
Well, I think I should be a bit humble about that because I'm not there and I can't say that what happens in America is necessarily a blueprint for what will happen elsewhere. I would certainly suggest that you vote. And I certainly would suggest that to the extent that it's possible to participate in the election, then you might do so, assuming you feel strongly about what the outcome might be. And I wish you very, very well in the elections. That's all I would say.
Well, thank you so much, Arnie. Thank you, everyone. Please stay safe. Have a wonderful evening. And it's great to have you all here with us. Take care. Ciao.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.